Welcome back to Velshine Rule. The nation watched Robert Mueller testify before two congressional committees, the House Intelligence and the House Judiciary. And now that we've heard from the former special counsel himself, the question is, what will the Democratic Party do next? Let's bring in a member of one of those committees, Congressman Jim Himes from Connecticut. He is a Democrat on the House Intel Committee. Congressman, this is not about a scorecard. For the Democratic Party, the goal is to get the president out of office. What is your game plan today? Is it the 2020 election or is it impeachment?
Well, there certainly aren't indications that Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi is moving forward with impeachment. And I think she is, as she always does, keeping a very, very close eye on what is her touchstone, public sentiment. And I think I haven't talked to her about it, but my sense is that she doesn't feel that public sentiment is at a place right now across the country, which, of course, is different than, southwestern Connecticut, which is where my duties are. I don't think she's there yet. And, I don't need to tell you that we're now going away for 5 or 6 weeks for the August vacation. We come back and time continues to pass. So, look, at this point, I don't think there's a lot to talk about with respect to impeachment. And remember, even if there is impeachment, the Senate will never convict. I see absolutely no scenario where that happens. And so, yes, as a practical matter, 2020 is the moment of accountability for this president.
But if public sentiment is the most important thing, what do Democrats need to do? We watched that hearing and we watched a Republican look at Robert Mueller and again ask about this being a hoax and a witch hunt. When you and I, who've both read the report, know this investigation yielded 199 criminal charges.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And public sentiment is a hard thing to talk about because public sentiment in Westport, Connecticut and Zanesville, Ohio mean very different things. And so what I mean is, if you agree with me that there is no way that this president is removed through impeachment, 2020, there are 5 or 6 states that are all important to the 2020 election. And I think public sentiment in those states in particular is particularly important if you are thinking about 2020, which, of course, is not the only thing you think about with respect to impeachment. It is a very big and divisive thing. But look, I think there are a lot of Americans out there. I know there are a lot of Americans out there who say, I know this president is a liar. He doesn't even try to hide it. I know this president has done an awful lot of bad things, but I like him because of X, Y, Z. And this is something that we Democrats need to be careful about. When I talk to my friends in the Midwest, for example, they say, hey, you know what? It's funny. Donald Trump, they may not like him way at home, but it's not coming up a lot. Impeachment is not coming up a lot. The Mueller report is not coming up a lot. You know what is coming up? Healthcare costs. My fear that I won't be able to educate my kid, my worry about retirement. We cannot lose that message.
And what the president is saying to those people is that he's creating a new false narrative that has impacted public sentiment. And his narrative is that Democrats are all socialists who are going to blow up the entire system. So what do you do with that impact it's had on public sentiment?
Well, I think we say 2 things. Number one, no, we are not socialists, and I'm happy to say that. And I think pretty much all of my Democratic colleagues are happy to say that as well. We believe in a market economy. The market economy has created more wealth on the planet Earth than any other single force. But it needs to be a regulated market economy so that we don't ever see a financial meltdown like we saw in 2008. And by the way, it needs to be fairer. And what I would say to the American people on the issue of economics and kitchen table issues is, look at the president. He may say he has your interests at heart, but he is hell-bent and determined to take away your health care. Read the court case that he is supporting. That is about taking away your health care. And look, the president is very, very good at muddying the waters. But it is up to us.
Then realize people aren't going to read that report. They're going to listen to 3-word slogans. So how do you combat that?
Stephanie, my point is that if it's about public sentiment, it's not about the report. Most people in America aren't going to spend a lot of time on the finer points of obstruction of justice and the 3-part test for obstruction.
I'm saying you said they should read in on the president's proposal on health care. They're not going to read all of that. They're just going to listen to who's controlling that narrative. So do Democrats need to say, this is how the president plays the game, let's play it smarter and better?
So, Stephanie, I was a freshman here when we passed the Affordable Care Act, and I'm here to tell you that if you get through to the American people on something as close to home as their health care, and if you make the case that the president is doing something that would throw 20 million of you off of your health insurance, and despite his lies, and look, I think every American knows that this president is a liar, despite his lies, if you have a pre-existing condition, you would be very much at risk. I know that the American people will hear that if we just explain it in a reasonable way.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.